Today I have 4 Anthropologie-inspired home decor projects to share with you, so let's get started. For the first one, I'm taking my Craft Smart polymer clay and rolled it out and then cut out a bunch of squares using a cutter. Next, I took each of the squares and held it so one of the corners is facing up, more like a diamond, and then I rolled in the two sides onto each other, but then folded the corners back out to make a petal shape. I wanted the petals to look organic and not like they were all identical, so I pinched the back and kind of bent it in different directions. The Anthropologie version has more pointed looking petals, so I also gently pulled on the top to elongate them. Once I had a few petals made, I started adding them to a vase. And since the bottom of the petals is rolled in and comes to a point, I used that part to mold it to the vase. I also used this liquid Sculpey, which acts as a glue, and added a dab under each petal so it stays in place once it's baked. I rolled up the rest of my petals and added them to the vase, trying to closely mimic the shape of the Anthropologie version. And once I had all of the petals attached, I put the vase into the oven at 275 degrees Fahrenheit for 15 minutes. Then turned the oven off and let the glass cool down inside. I made 2 vases and spray painted them, which apparently I didn't hit record for, but I used heirloom white on one and khaki on the other, both by Rust-Oleum, and that was it for these. I love the way they turned out, and I only had to spend money on one of the spray paints, but if you had to buy everything, this would cost about $28 for both compared to Anthropologie at $96. For this Anthropologie dupe, I'm using a Dollar Tree basket, and I'm only using this basket for the shape. If you had something similar, it would work because next I'm going to cover the basket with canvas drop cloth fabric. I picked this up from Home Depot just to have it on hand. They carry several different sizes for as low as $10. I covered the basket in 2 layers of the drop cloth, and the first layer I cut pretty close to the same size of the basket and wanted to cover up the handles as well. I wasn't going to paint the basket, but I did end up painting the inside and the bottom later on. It would definitely be easier to paint that before adding the fabric though. For the bottom, I cut slits into the fabric so it would mold around the curves with minimal wrinkles on the sides. Then I added a second layer, hot gluing it on top of the first, but I cut the second layer wider so that I could fold it over on the inside and have that canvas bag rim like the Anthropologie one. And I finished the bottom the same way as the first layer. So I covered up the handles, and I want there to be handles on this basket, so I took my scissors and cut a slit in the middle of where the handle is and then folded it inward so you don't see that plastic and glued it down. Now I need to add the daisies. I did a few so I could figure out the best way to do this before showing you guys. I'm sure there's another way I could have done this, but I'm pretty happy with how they turned out. I took 4mm macrame cord, which I get from Amazon, and it's always linked in my description box, and I cut down 7 pieces. The length doesn't really matter here because we'll end up cutting them down more, but for the least amount of waste, I would cut them to about 3 inches. Then you want to pull the cords apart. The macrame is made up of 3 pieces twisted together, so I just untwisted them and I divided them into 2 piles of 10. To add the threads to the basket, I'm using yellow cotton twine. This is actually the colored twine that Dollar Tree had out last year, so it's pretty thick. And I took one group of 10 and added it horizontally, then added the second group of 10 vertically. Like I said, I'm sure there's a better way that I could have done this, but I just couldn't figure out how. Then I wrapped the center with the thread a few times and kind of fanned out the macrame as I went so it would start creating more of a circle shape. Once the middle was as big as I wanted, I finished it off with a vertical line of thread on both sides, and then tied off the thread inside the basket and cut it off. Next, I cut off all of the excess macrame and shaped the flower. I repeated this several times around the basket, but I won't bore you with all of that, so let's take a look at the numbers. The Anthropologie version cost $34. I had all of these materials on hand, but you could find everything you needed at the Dollar Tree for just $5. next up, this project took me a really long time to create, and I had a few ideas on how I could have made it easier in case you want to recreate this. I'm taking this tomato garden stake, and I think this is where I went wrong. I'm making a woven basket, and because this has the circle rings to hold the shape, I had to cut each row of twine and add them individually. If I was recreating this, I would add sturdy wire like this 16 gauge rebar around a circle base. That way you can continue looping the twine around continuously. Lessons learned. But I wanted more than just the 3 vertical points that the tomato stake had, so I added 15 more using the rebar wire and my favorite Starbond superglue to secure them in place. Next, I'm taking some jute twine and adding it on top of all the vertical wires to cover them up. I found this massive spool of twine at one of my local thrift stores, such a great find, and I left some twine longer at the bottoms so I can curl them under. Once I have all of the wires covered, I'm going to start weaving the basket. Like I said earlier, because of the metal rings, I had to cut each strand of twine individually, which made this project take hours longer than it needed to. So I chose one section that I wanted to be the back and made sure I started and ended each piece in the same spot to be the back. This bottom section is going to have a basic weave pattern going over under, over under, over under each wire, and the next strand right on top of that going under over, and I added 8 rows like this. Next, I'm going to leave a little gap and then add 2 rows of twine going in the same pattern over under, and continue up the basket, leaving space between each row on this section. I wish I had put the rows a little bit closer together for this bottom portion. I did 6 rows like this and then decided I didn't like the look of just one vertical twine per section, so I went back and added a second right next to it. I think this looks much better with the doubled up rows I just added. Then I went back to the single alternating rows close together and added 9 rows like this and repeated the pattern all the way up the basket. After the next section, I wanted the top to start tapering in, so I took my wire cutters and cut off that remaining top metal ring. This was pretty difficult since I have no hand strength, but once I got it off, I bent the wires inward, creating that tapered look and continued weaving in the twine. Finally, when I got close to the top, I bent the wires straight up to create the mouth of the basket and added the remaining twine section. To finish the top, I bent the wires all the way in and hot glued the top 2 rows in place. To clean up the hot glue strings all over the twine, I took my heat gun to the basket and melted them in, and then I took a lighter to the whole thing. This part I was a little bit nervous about since it was such a large piece. A few parts did catch on fire, but I quickly put them out and it was fine. I wish I would have left the basket in this natural twine, but the Anthropologie versions were painted or they had used colored wicker. Either way, I ended up spray painting the basket black, but I didn't like how the black looked at all. It was way too dark. You couldn't see any of the basket detail. So I went back over it in the color smoky beige. Walmart has been sold out of all their spray paints for months, but when I was looking for colors for this video, they were fully stocked. If your stores have been sold out recently, check back and see if they're in stock now. They had so many great neutral colors this past week. Let me know what you think about this one. My version cost about $25 with the thrifted twine, wire, and spray paint, compared to Anthropologie at $158 for the large version. which is 24 inches, and mine came in at 23 and a quarter, so very close. This was a very time-consuming project because I had to keep cutting the twine. I think it took me about 8 hours to complete. I would like to try another basket where I can use one continuous piece in a future video. This one is more inspired by than a dupe because I didn't have a glass piece that resembled the Anthropologie version. The closest thing I had is this recycled glass piece I found thrifting recently, but I was too nervous to use this and mess it up. So instead I used a Dollar Tree glass piece and cut out a mandala type design on my Cricut. When applying a design to a curved surface, you want to start with the center and lay that down first. This will help avoid any wrinkles in your vinyl, and then lay down one side at a time. Once the vinyl is on the glass, I cut slits in the top and the bottom to make sure there were no air bubbles. I'm going to add an etched design, and you do not want the cream getting under the vinyl. This took some playing around. If the design was a touch smaller, it would have been fine. To add the etching, I'm using this Armor Etch product that I got from either Michael's or Hobby Lobby. This is the first time I've used this, so I was a little bit nervous, but it's super easy. To apply it, I used a palette knife and spread a thick layer on top of the vinyl. You want to be very careful here not to get the cream anywhere on the glass outside of the design. That's why I added the wide border around it. Then you want to let the cream sit for 5 to 10 minutes. The bottle says 3 minutes, but I didn't trust that, so I waited a little longer. After time was up, you can actually scrape the cream off and add it back into the bottle. I forgot to do that on this first section though, and then you want to wipe it off. I used a baby wipe because I didn't want the cream to wash down my drains, and after I had wiped it all off, then I rinsed the glass under warm water. I repeated this a few times around the glass and then added a rim around the top as well. The design is not as intricate as the Anthropologie one since I was a little too nervous it would turn out looking like a hot mess. But this project didn't cost me anything. I've had this bottle sitting around for a really long time. It does cost $20 for the larger bottle and $1 for the glass, compared to Anthropologie at $58, and the etching cream will last you years. For more DIY dupes, check out this video right here, and I'll see you in the next one.